Resuming debate, the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm pleased to have an opportunity to speak to Bill C-88 despite the use of time allocation. I appreciate that the government leader in the House, who earlier today said she would make efforts to give me a chance to speak, has done so that even with abbreviated debate, I'm able to speak to this bill. I was also able to speak to what happened to this legislation in the previous Parliament when the Northwest Territories Devolution Act was brought forward in 2014 in the 41st Parliament. It was something everyone wanted to support, but there were many measures within that were offensive to foundational principles of self-government, of respect for treaties. In fact, the Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board, the Gwich'in Land and Water Board, the Sahtu Land and Water Board, and the Wesakee-Titcho Water and Land and Water Board, all of which were the result of treaty negotiations between the Crown and those nations, were callously, carelessly, disrespectfully, completely violated with the notion that we could replace them with something, I guess, described as more efficient. I protested those changes at the time, as did the previous Member of Parliament from the Northwest Territories, NDP member Dennis Bevington. We tried quite hard to persuade the Parliament, the 41st Parliament, that it was wrong to change the law in this way. Now, subsequent to the changes being made, and I won't go through all the steps of what took place, Mr. Speaker, but a number of the boards that were impacted went to court to challenge what had just happened, because the principle that had been there, the land and water boards represented 50-50 decision-making between First Nations and the federal government. This notion of a super board was deeply offensive to that and would have reduced the self-government that, in fact, the Northwest Territories Devolution Act was supposed to respect, would have taken away rights and reduced the scope of review by those various boards. Earlier today in debate, I heard a member from the Conservative Party rise to say that Bill C-88 was another effort by the Liberal government to interfere with development, to thwart development, and to drive away investment in Canada. I'm saddened by that kind of commentary, because I will agree with a number of criticisms of the current Liberal government. There are a lot of measures being taken that I find far short of what's required, particularly when looking at the climate crisis, far short of what's required when looking at the need for thorough environmental assessment. There was a commitment in the election to undo the damage that had been done by the Harper administration in a number of areas. And so far, the Liberal government has done really well in some areas and less well on others. They did extremely well in undoing discriminatory legislation towards trade unions. And that was undone relatively quickly by the former member of Cabinet who represented concern on labor issues. They did a very good job on a piece of legislation that's still before the Senate, and I do hope it passes quickly, Bill C-68, to repair the Fisheries Act. An extremely good job was done there. Bill C-68 not only repairs the damage of what was done by the former Prime Minister in that government, but actually improves, not just brings back protection for fish habitat, but expands other protections for habitat. It's an extremely important piece of legislation, and I hope it passes quickly. It also very complementary to the piece of legislation that I hope we'll see completely passed here, which earlier today in this House, the Honourable Member for Avalon, Chair of the Fisheries Committee, presented the report that Bill S-203 is now back before the House. I hope we move to report stage and third reading very expeditiously. But C-68, which I'm referencing, also is complementary in saying that we're now going to ban the taking of cetaceans into captivity in Canadian waters. Again, these all speak to undoing the damage done by the previous government, but in C-68 going beyond that with more progressive measures. C-69, unfortunately, is also before the Senate. I hope it will get amended and brought back quickly. But the Minister of Transportation did an excellent job in repairing the Navigable Waters Protection Act. There are some innovative changes to energy regulation. Unfortunately, the middle piece of legislation in that omnibus bill, the one on environmental review, doesn't undo the damage of the previous government. It rather keeps it in place. But this legislation is excellent in that it actually does undo the damage of what the previous government had done. It sets back in place the integrity of self-government, of decisions for land and water boards that reflect the negotiations under self-government agreements and treaties. I would like to see, now that we are debating this bill at second reading, I certainly would like to see this bill in committee to accept one or two additional amendments, as has been mentioned on the floor of this House earlier today when we started debate at second reading on C-68. It would be, I think, given the content and the context and the need to take a step farther, be more progressive than merely repairing, the place to do that is to say that this bill operates under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That would be a very welcome amendment, and one, assuming this bill does get to committee and we are in a position to put forward amendments clause by clause, one that the committee can expect to hear from the Green Party. I know I have an allocation of more time available, Mr. Speaker, but I've made all the points that I wanted to make. I certainly support this bill, including those provisions to allow moratoria on drilling to affect such decisions based on evidence. I do hope the bill passes. I'd like to see it pass with an amendment to ensure that it operates under the terms of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Northwest Territories.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for the report card. Certainly appreciate her comments, and I certainly appreciate her history on this bill and the whole devolution process that happened in Northwest Territories. I still think the devolution process has a long ways to go. As I mentioned earlier, there's certain parts of the Northwest Territories that were off the table when it came to discussions for devolving responsibility. That included the Norman Wells oil fields, that included the Beaufort Sea. I think our regulatory process in the Northwest Territories is a model that probably the rest of this country could look at and compare notes and see how well it works when it comes to the inclusion of Indigenous people. I also think it's high time that we started looking at the work that's being done on traditional knowledge and the scientific research that's being done on the Beaufort Sea. And we also start looking at the devolution of responsibility for decision-making on the Beaufort Sea to the government of Northwest Territories along with the Indigenous government. And that's my question to the member to give her view on turning over all the responsibilities for all parts of the Northwest Territories to the people of Northwest Territories.
For Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you to the Honourable Member for the Northwest Territories. The process of devolution, I agree with the Honourable Member, is incomplete. People from the North should have the decision-making responsibility over their resources, their lands, and their waters. This is behind the principle of devolution, and to the extent that specific areas are excluded, I think that's an error and should be corrected. I will say that we want to ensure that discussions in the territories also represent the concerns of the specific First Nations mentioned in this legislation, but so much of the territory around our circumpolar north is under the jurisdiction of the Inuit. We need to pay attention to that, and we also need to make sure that we have, as the Honourable Member mentioned, respect and engage Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science. It's particularly compelling that we do so in the context of the climate crisis, where we know that Canada's Arctic is warming 3 times faster than the rest of the warming on the planet. We've known for quite a while that it's been the Inuit who first raised the alarm, and the peoples of the North who raised the alarm that sea ice is changing, that hunting is more difficult, that a way of life is basically at risk. So the more that we consult, the more that decision-making is led by Northerners, I think the better our decision-making will be.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Yukon.
Thank the member. I appreciate her support of our First Nation, particularly the battle we've had over a decade to try and prevent drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. She mentioned that this law was that we're taking back a law that was unfortunate or wrong. I'd just like to say it was illegal, because the land claims agreement are constitutionally protected. You can't just pass a law that retracts a constitutionally protected item. And just to mention, I appreciate her support on an almost very parallel exercise that happened in the Yukon, where once again, for the environmental process, they tried to change, not in line with the spirit or probably the law of the constitutionally protected land claim, the environmental assessment process, and the member supported us in that, and we've retracted that, changed it, and gone back to the spirit of the agreement and the letter of the law that was originally contemplated in 30 years of negotiation.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I thank my friend from the Yukon. Absolutely, my language was too tepid. It's unusual, but that is the case. This was unconstitutional, what happened under the previous Parliament. And as far as fighting together to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the honourable member said it's been a decade. Well, I hate to correct the honourable member's math, but by quick reference to Google, because I couldn't remember exactly what year I was in Washington, D.C. with this honourable member fighting to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but I quickly checked Google because I remember I took my daughter and a young Gwich'in lad to go see the opening of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. So it was in 2002 that the honourable member and I were together in Washington, D.C., and I want to pay tribute to this member from the Yukon because I know that all those trips to Washington were beyond his parliamentary budget. He paid his own way to go to Washington to work as hard as we could, and now we have to redouble efforts because the Trump administration once again wants to lift protection and allow drilling in the calving grounds of the porcupine caribou, which are essential to the Gwich'in way of life.